Is this working? It is. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to OLLI, and my name is Karen Bantal, and I'll be moderating our session today. Thank you for coming. We've got audience here in Towsley Auditorium and also online on the Zoom platform. So thank you for attending. Today is the first in our summer lecture morning series titled Breathing Life into Old Buildings. This lecture is titled Detroit from Ruins to Riches, and our speaker today is Liz Knibbe, and more about Liz in a minute. Today's program, of course, is a hybrid production, both in person at Towsley and online. As in our other programs, we'll be taking questions from the audience, both on the Zoom platform and also in the audience here. We have two mic handlers here who will take questions. And so please write your questions on the note cards and you'll be passing them to the mic handlers. For the folks who are on the platform on Zoom, the Q&A function is at the bottom middle of your screen, so please just put your questions there. Please don't put your questions in the chat function. Sometimes we have people do that, so it's more straightforward to have it in the chat function. Also, there's a closed captioning option for you in the middle of the screen, just a little bit to the right. If you'd like to have closed captioning, you can click on that. I wanted to mention several upcoming events before we get started. And the first is next June 13th. We have a couple more lectures in this series that Al Pass is going to mention to you. So Tuesday, June 13th, we have the next in the Al Gorgie Distinguished Lecture Series, and that is titled Migration, the Complicated History of the United States. And that is with speaker Professor Saeed Khan. And then on Wednesday, June 14th, we have an out-of-town event, and this looks like a lot of fun. It's spend the day on Belle Isle, enjoy the sight, sounds, rich history, beauty, and monuments. And this is a tour of the island by motor coach, and there are spots available still for that. So before we get started, just a legal disclaimer. The views expressed here do not necessarily reflect those of the University of Michigan or of OLLI. And so our format today also, as you are familiar, is approximately 1 hour presentation, and then we'll have 30 minutes for Q&A. So with that, I'll pass it to Al to introduce our speaker. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen, and welcome to the summer series. It's called Breathing New Life into Old Buildings. It's going to be a short series, just 3 sessions, today and the next 2 weeks, and with 4 speakers. Next week we'll have a husband and wife team who happen to be with us here today also. As a brief introduction to what the series in itself is all about. As a civilized people, we live in a built environment. So that environment includes roads and bridges, railroads and airports, docks and tunnels and buildings. Lots and lots of buildings. Buildings that we live in, we play in, we work in, and sometimes we listen to lectures in. So, how and where these activities take place changes over time, and therefore the building and the other public spaces around them also must change. Change always involves the need to make decisions. For buildings, we need to decide if the best decision involves demolition and replacement, which we've seen a lot of here in Ann Arbor in the past 10 years or so, or preservation, renovation, and reuse. Our 3 sessions will going to be focused on the second route here, preservation, renovation, and reuse. All 4 of our speakers are architects who have spent their careers in this aspect of the profession. 3 of them have been associated with the architectural firm of Quinn Evans, and we'll hear a little bit more about that from our speaker today. So, our first presentation will feature projects in the Detroit Ann Arbor area and buildings and spaces that many of us are familiar with. The final lecture will focus on the role that renovation and reuse can play in the larger scheme of things. That larger scheme is to illustrate how the path of preservation, renovation, and reuse can employ fresh ideas to address social goals, specifically those related to climate change, revitalizing urban neighborhoods, and mitigating past social injustices. That's our overall goal of this series. So, today's speaker is Elizabeth Knibbe, better known as Liz, a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and a principal emeritus of the Quinn Evans firm. She's also a graduate of the University of Michigan. She has won numerous awards as a specialist in the adaptive reuse of historic buildings. Her projects cover a wide range of historic buildings, from small, long-abandoned structures to major landmarks such as Detroit's Old Wayne County Building, the Fox Theater, and the Michigan Central Railroad Depot, which is, I understand, going to be the new home of the Ford Motor Company's electric vehicle department, and is currently under construction. In addition, she was involved with the Knapp's Building and the Ottawa Street Power Station in Lansing and the fiberglass tower in Toledo. It's a very, very impressive portfolio. So, in addition to her presentation here today, Liz will be the tour guide for the Ollie out-of-town bus tour in Detroit on June 23rd. That bus tour has been sold out from the first day that it was opened. However, if you are on the waiting list, there are oftentimes last-minute cancellations, so check back. If you are on the waiting list, you may still have a chance to participate in that. We will have an after-lunch meeting with the speaker today. We have one open seat at this point, so if you are interested in that and have not signed up for lunch at this point, that is a possibility. And with that, would you please join me in welcoming Liz Knibbe to our Ollie stage here. Thank you.
Well, good morning. And so you guys here are going to have to stand in for all this. You can't hear it? It's on. Better? Oh, no wonder I hit the microphone. Better? Yes. So first I'm going to do a little bit of introduction of myself and of Quinn Evans. So when I started school in architecture school at U of M, in the mid-'70s, the professors were all kind of urban renewal guys, mid-century modern, form follows function. Didn't really catch my eye, but there was this one class taught by these two guys, Dave Evans and Mike Quinn, on historic preservation. This was kind of interesting. It turns out they worked for a firm in town called Preservation Urban Design, which was one of the first firms in the country that specialized in historic preservation, because it was something that really didn't exist at any scale before the centennial, before 1976. And so I got lucky. I got master's degrees in architecture and urban planning, and preservation urban design needed a planner. Couldn't keep a person busy full time, so I was perfect. I could do architecture half the time, planning half the time. And there, we all really started to invent preservation in a way of, how do you work with these old buildings? What do you keep? What do you get rid of? And we cut our teeth on it. Preservation Urban Design moved Mike Quinn to Washington, D.C. because there's a lot of historic buildings in Washington, D.C. But the firm didn't survive the early 80s, so Mike and David decided to open a firm in Ann Arbor specializing in preservation. But Mike got so much work in DC that he never left DC. So Quinn Evans Architects started with an office with David in Ann Arbor and with Mike in DC. And as they started working, and then very soon, Eileen Tyler, who will speak next week, went to work with them and also loved old buildings and became a great architect specializing in preservation. In the firm, because they were working in old buildings, very quickly started doing museums, and they were doing schools, and they were doing lots of government buildings and higher ed buildings. And so in preservation, you end up being kind of generalist, and you get to work on a lot of different building types. So time goes on. Dave, unfortunately, dies young in the 90s. Then Mike's running both offices and keeping the firm going. And then in 2005, in Washington, D.C., he hires Carl Elefante, who will speak in the third in the series, who's really a specialist in sustainability and what are the roles of buildings in making our environment more stable over the long time, existing buildings. And then he hires me here, and I've been working for my career. I've been working for myself for 20 years, basically recycling old buildings, working for private developers and nonprofit community developers, turning underutilized and long vacant buildings into new uses. So I come and kind of bring that private sector to Quinn Evans. The firm continues to grow and prosper. We buy our firm in Baltimore. We buy another one in Richmond. It is now a 200-person firm that does new buildings, old buildings, in a variety of sectors. I say we don't do offices, we don't do hospitals, we probably do pretty much everything else. For the last 2 years, it was the top museum design firm in the country. It is also now one of the largest female majority-owned firms in the country. So it's a pretty interesting place. But its heart is always in, its heart is always in preservation and what it means, what buildings mean to us as a culture. So, well, I want to ask you a couple of questions. So you guys are going to have to stand in for everybody who's on Zoom. But first I want to know, did any of you graduate from a Detroit high school? We got one. Oh, two. So maybe 20% of the audience. Did anybody graduate from suburban Detroit or Ann Arbor High School? Yeah, many more. How many of you go to Detroit on any kind of a regular basis? More than I would have thought. That's really good. How many wouldn't go to Detroit if we dragged you there? No one's going to admit that. Yeah, we got one that'll actually admit that. Well, I hope after today you'll start to get very intrigued and want to go just to see all that's happening there. So we're going to talk today mostly about Midtown and a little bit about downtown. And Midtown really starts in the Cultural Center. And it runs from 94 down to Mack and then between the Lodge and 75, so kind of the heart of the area right north of downtown. And what's really special about what was called the University Cultural Center area is that we have this incredible concentration of public cultural resources. There's the Detroit Institute of Arts, the main library, Wayne State University, Center for Creative Studies, the Children's Museum, and it's just phenomenal that you have all of these things that concentrated in one area in a city. We're the only city in the country that has this concentration. Other cities has all these resources, but not all together. So these guys, the heads of these organizations are in the 70s are looking around their neighborhood and watching it fall apart around them. The only new investment in this neighborhood that was not done by the university was a couple of housing towers that were done by one of the churches. Other than that, there was zero investment going in the private sector. So all you see is the buildings getting worse and slowly buildings getting torn down, and it's concerning. So they formed an organization called the University Cultural Center Association. And the University Cultural Center Association essentially discovered a program that the National Trust for Historic Preservation put together to save small towns. It's called the Main Street Program. They'll never say they use the Main Street Program, but they absolutely use the Main Street Program. And the Main Street Program has 4 tenets. One is take care of the public sphere. First, they started picking up the trash. Then they planted the medians. And then they started improving parks, put in a gardening park where you can grow your own vegetables. They put in a pedestrian bike loop that now connects to another pedestrian bike loop that goes to Eastern Market and eventually down to the riverfront. So that they have been consistently over 40 years improving the public sphere. The second thing they did is hold public events. Bring the public into your space. If you've never been to any of these events, I really encourage you to go. Fortunately, they don't do festivals of the arts anymore. I suspect there's one big one coming next year. If it comes, go. Noel night is really sweet. All the institutions open up and invite people in, and then they have special things around the holidays events. A lot of stuff for kids. De-electricity is a art, light as art, that happens about every 2 years. Also really fun. And these events bring in thousands of people from all over the region and introduce them to the Cultural Center. The other thing that the Main Street Program does is says, support your entrepreneurs, both from a retail standpoint, the guys who are in the spaces, and as the developers, and which UCCA did, because a lot of the earlier stuff was done by really urban pioneer developers. And the last thing is promote good design, both in the redoing of the old buildings and in bringing in new buildings. And mostly they succeed. There's a few buildings there that I absolutely hate, new ones, but mostly it continues to get better, the quality of design of what's going on in the area. So those forces are at work starting in the 70s and especially starting in the 80s. But I think that the neighborhood, the first good thing that happens to the neighborhood is saving Orchestra Hall. So in the 70s, the orchestra had left in the 40s, and then it was Paradise Valley, you know, jazz heaven. And then by the 50s, that had pretty much died, and there were occasional events in it, but it was really not being invested in. And by the early 70s, it was slated for demolition so that they could put up a Burger King. Fortunately, there was some idealists who said, no, we don't want to do that. We're going to save Orchestra Hall. And so they saved Orchestra Hall. They didn't have a user, but they managed to raise the money to buy the building and control the building and to start to rehab it. And it was in really rough shape. But they put about $6 million in it, stabilized it, convinced the orchestra to come back, which is phenomenal. So in the 80s, the orchestra comes back, and then in the early 90s, it gets the Max, the addition on it, which is another little black box theater and really state-of-the-art support facilities for both the public and for the theater. And I know you're all Ann Arborites, but I tell you, drive to Detroit and go hear an event in Orchestra Hall. The acoustics are wonderful. So Orchestra Hall gets saved. So then what happens? Well, they build Orchestra Place, this office building, which is mostly medical offices next door to it. And then you get across the street, oh, I got a pointer. You get the Ellington, which are condos, some of the first condos, new condos for sale in the city. And then you get Whole Foods. Heaven, if you live down there. Have good food in the city. And we also get the Detroit High School for the Arts is actually behind Orchestra Hall. So you have this one building, and these things happen around it, and it hasn't stopped because we're going to get now a Target. And I've lived in this neighborhood, and I can't tell you how many times I said, boy, I wish there was a Target. I want to be able to buy a teapot in my neighborhood, and now there will be. So you see one building, and all this other stuff happens, and you can't imagine it being the same if the heart of this is a Burger King. So saving these buildings has a domino effect on the areas around them that's really important. So the next is the DIA. So the DIA in the 70s had a thing called the Founders Society, which was who raised all the money to kind of support it from the side. And they bought these houses on one street north of the DIA. And there was an alternative doctor in this one, and this one was used for storage for the Children's Museum, and this one was housing for students for CCS, as was this one, which means they were really abused. And this one was storage for another cultural institution, so really underutilized. They were at the point where they really had to put some money into these buildings or tear them down. And I can tell you there were members on that board who wanted to tear them down and put in another parking lot. You can always use more parking, especially surface parking. And so UCCA stepped in and said, let us do a study and see what the options are for these buildings. And the best option that they came up with was actually to put a bed and breakfast in the boutique hotel. So it's now a 42-room boutique hotel. It was developed by a for-profit subsidiary of UCCA and the Founders Society. They ran it. It's consistently been 10 points above the average occupancy with lots of great rave reviews. It closed for COVID, sold to a new operator, and now is continuing to operate as an inn. So what does that mean for the neighborhood? Well, once we open up the inn on Ferry Street, all of a sudden things start to happen in the next blocks. There are 3 houses that are now condoed, really big houses that are put into units that are more affordable. The school at the end of the street gets done, and you get this infill construction, first these townhouses and then these other townhouses. So all of a sudden the street is a viable residential street again, very stable. And again, you see that domino effect. Then you have the St. Paul, the Episcopalian Church, which was the church that had built the 2 elderly towers in the 60s. And I won't show you pictures in those because they look like elderly towers from the 60s. But they had bought more property around them. And one of the things they bought was the Garfield building. Now, this building was actually built originally as a 2-story building. And then very quickly after, in like 1908, in 1912, they add the upper floors. And this is really a light industrial building. It sits across the street from a mansion, from the David Whitney mansion, but these are zoning days, and it has a tire sales store in it, and it has assembly of basic car parts going on in the upper floors. Eventually, it becomes one of the original homes of Wayne County Community College, and they improve it. Let's, you need to see what it looked like originally. That's what it looked like originally. So they improve it. You know, nothing can look old because old is bad. And so they actually took the terracotta off in all these horizontal panels and put this lovely black stuff on. So on this one, when they first said, oh, we're going to do this one, I thought, you're nuts. No one's ever going to do this. No one's ever going to finance it. It's never going to happen. But it did. We were able to use the original drawings to actually, this is not terracotta. It's a false material that replaces it. It was one of the first loft buildings in the city. And it was a proof of concept. The banks would not finance it. So it's financed using, actually, retirement fund from, I think, the Fireman's Fund in Detroit, provided the basic mortgage. And then the first floor is a Rite Aid drugstore. For some reason, that picture is distorted. But it was a proof of concept, because once they opened it, it was always full. And it kind of showed, if we build it, they will come. Because there had been no new housing built in the center city since the 50s. And we're now in the 80s, in the 90s. And people do want to live here. They work here, they go to school here. There's loads of jobs down here between downtown, the medical center, and the university, and the Henry Ford Health System hospitals. Loads of jobs, but not places where people want to live. So once you give them a place to want to live, they would come, and this was a proof of concept. So what happens with this is behind it, there are two, actually there used to be two of them, there's only one survived, two tenement apartment buildings. And so the church buys them because they can't have, we saw in construction what was going on, and it was literally dead bodies in the parking lot. I mean, these were really bad buildings. The exits were padlocked shut, the emergency exit on the back of this building. And it has, you know, the original gas system and the original lighting system, electrical system. There were little fires and stuff. I mean, these were not safe buildings. So the church bought them, both of them, and relocated the people to affordable housing. Did a good job of that. But then the building sat vacant because it took so long to put the financing together, because it was still very difficult to finance these projects. So there were some more fires, and the building gets to the point where you tear this one down, right? Very clearly a tear down. Well, nothing's a tear down in my world. So we rebuilt it. You know, we had to reframe some of the inside. It's all new plumbing, all new up-to-date insulation, all new building systems. And you can bring back buildings that are pretty far, and it's still better than anything new that they're building in terms of the quality of the spaces in the building and the quality of the light in those spaces and just the character of the building on the street. The real cool thing about this particular building is it's almost net zero energy. We insulated it right, put new windows, those kinds of things. It's got a geothermal heating system. It's got hot water panels, solar panels on the roof. It's got electric solar panels on the roof. It shows that even with a very beat up old building, you can be very energy conscious and successful in creating a very green building. So what happens when that happens is that you see a art gallery comes in around the corner, and then he buys these buildings and puts in Sava restaurant along this little pedestrian alley that connects this building and the Garfield building. And then you get MoCAD, Museum of Contemporary Design Detroit on the corner, and then you get the big new development, which is something like 86 housing units, first floor retail, and something like 300 parking spaces that are now hidden. You can't see them, that will serve the whole neighborhood. So you take an area that was nothing, and you create a neighborhood, and it's really around these historic buildings that happens. Then we go into kind of the main street of Midtown and of UCCA is Cass Street. There's Woodward, of course, that goes through the middle, but the real heart of the neighborhood is Cass. And the first building that we see down on Cass is this one's called the Stuberstone. It was originally a car dealership. The second floor had a ramp that goes up to it. It's where you maintain the cars, so it was really kind of industrial on the upper floors. And it wasn't vacant when we got it, but it was pretty underutilized. And then we put true lofts in this thing, the two-story lofts where you overlook the second floor. It's very cool. The first floor originally had a medical office in it. Now it has neighborhood-oriented retail in it. And they've since sold, these units now sell for something just under $500,000. So you take something that was a fairly useless building, and by investing in it 20 years later, it has real value. Then what we see going around it is all these stars up here are things that happen as a result of it. Around the corner first is Avalon. How many of you know the story of Avalon Bakery? So these two women start this bakery for really socially conscious reasons. They want to hire local people and provide good, healthy food, and they do a great job. And this is where they're located. Then all of a sudden, magically, the rest of the street has all these other little retail and food stuffs in it because they're an anchor there. And you see this kind of neighborhood service start to develop around that anchor. Around the corner, you have traffic jam, which has been in place since the 60s. And people come, whenever there's an event in town, traffic jam is full. The suburbanites love traffic jam. Of course, so it's an anchor, but everything around it is vacant, and you'll see those buildings in a minute. It, of course, had a fire last year. I guarantee you it's going to get rebuilt. It will be rebuilt. Might not be quite the same. They're going to put housing above it, so they're going to densify the site. And I think this guy knows how to deal with burnt buildings. I'll show you another burnt building that he did. So I have total confidence that that one's coming back. Across the street, you get, in what was a carriage barn, one of the first breweries in the city. And so you have kind of those two things in an anchor, and then you have this lovely thing sitting next to them. And so this is obviously also early auto industry building, and it becomes the Campfield Lofts. So this is one of the first lofts that are done for sale in the city. They sold out their first 10 units in a week. Again, it shows that there's a demand, and these also continue to be a heavy demand on them. What's nice on this one is that what happened is these first floor lofts were bought by a brother and a sister couple who were running these kind of cute little businesses on the internet, Citybird and Nest, selling stuff. And now they've got these outlets there, so they're starting to build this kind of retail base in this neighborhood. And they're still there now, 20 years later. Then across the street comes in Chinola and Third Man Records and Jolly Pumpkin, and all of a sudden, the whole thing is done, and it really works. I tell you, one day, it was like 2014, I think. It's like the end of November, beginning of December, and I'm driving through the neighborhood, and there's these two obviously suburban ladies laden down with bags, and I thought, oh my goodness, this is a change. Literally down the street from here was where you could buy, in the 60s or in the 70s when I was in school and came down here, where you could buy all sorts of alternative services. And that had been cleaned out. And so it's an amazing transformation that occurs over time, based on these interesting buildings. Shinola did not want to be in a new building, I can guarantee you that. Then we go right behind Shinola is the Willys, another early industrial building. And these lofts are now selling for over $1 million. I mean, it's amazing. And you'll see the building where I lived in. It's a wonderful neighborhood to live in because you can walk to anything. I mean, I can walk to Orchestra Hall and to the DIA. I mean, the quality of life that you can have down here is really pretty phenomenal. This was a building that was built, was one of the first new buildings, and this is one of the ones where I don't think the design is very successful, but they also had no money. It was really, really hard to finance it, so they built it with almost no money. The important thing was the first floor, is that UCCA master leased the first floor to assure that it would get local retailers only in it. They were interested on Cass Avenue of having everything be local. And so they've done that, and so there's a little bookstore there, there's a gift store there, I think there's a pet supply store in there, there's kind of stuff that serves the neighborhood and kind of the regional, the specialized shopping area, but it adds a lot of character to the place. And then we get coming in from Grand Rapids, name's gone, brew pub, and you really start to see that this energy generating in this neighborhood. So when you start to look at, you see all these stars and it's like one building at a time. The red ones are all rehabs. The blue ones are either anchors or new construction. Actually, the only blue one is Avalon. And so all of this stuff is happening just by one, saving these kind of mediocre buildings. I mean, I haven't showed you a great building here, but they're nice buildings, and they create a really nice urban character. Then it goes on. So Green Garage is again around the corner from that neighborhood. It was a auto showroom, was bought by a guy who was really into being green. This building is also almost net energy, but low-tech net energy, really highly insulated. They run their cooling air through ducts underneath the ground to cool the air before they cool it, so they don't have to use energy to cool it, and all sorts of really cool things. And it's a business incubator, so lots of people use this space on a regular basis, and it's really very cool. But what's really cool is then this guy bought this building, which is the Elmore. And I looked at the Elmore for a lot of developers, and it just didn't work. It originally had 1 unit per floor that went front to back, and so it had a stairway at the front and a stairway on the back. So you couldn't divide it down into anything other but these too big of units for the current market. It just didn't work. Well, he came in, he not only, he put part of it into apartments, he actually put an addition on the side to provide the second stairway so that you could divide it up, and then he put, what is this, essentially a youth hostel in it. So they have guests that come there that say, some people who live there permanently, some that stay. Super green, also almost net zero. Really did a nice job. And he saved this building. Without somebody like that would take that kind of hands-on approach, that building was a goner. It's very cool. And the other thing he did is there was a vacant lot in the corner and with a little building on that site, and so he put in a garden center there. And right behind that is where the neighborhood community gardens are. So you have these people who are, again, the local entrepreneurs will do things that the nationals will never do that really make an interesting city. And this was a water tower that was on another building that you'll see in a few minutes that was going to be taken to the trash, and he said, no, give it to me. So the university gave it to him, and he made it as an entry into his park. So these local entrepreneurs really do things to make it an interesting city. And then we have Forest Arms, which is our next fire. So you get this this is a beautiful building, and it burns. And the owner is, he doesn't care. And the city's going, we got to tear it down. It's not safe, and UCCA is going, no, we're not going to do that. So they quickly, literally within about 3 or 4 days, put it in a coalition of a developer and some potential funders going, we're going to save this building. Now, it took them actually 3 years or 4 years to get it done, but they did. It's redone and restored with apartments, and always full. And that's the guy who owns Traffic Jam, did this job. So I have no worries about Traffic Jam. He'll take care of Traffic Jam. Then we have the Sherbrooke, which was a building that was built originally as 6 kind of high-end apartments, upper middle-class apartments. And in the 50s, it was divided into 24 really tiny apartments by Wayne State. And Wayne State ran it through the early 90s, and then they didn't want to deal with it anymore. Kind of need to be redone, and they wanted to tear it down. So UCCA convinced them to sell it to a developer. No, this was like the aughts. Sell it to a developer, and then that developer couldn't do it, and then I got it. So this was my project. And it didn't really work for student housing, and everybody thought, just make it a student housing building. And I have this feeling buildings will tell you what they want, if you'll just listen. And this one said, I don't want to be tiny apartments, but 6 apartments wasn't enough, so we ended up putting 12 in it, and we condoed it. It is now all owner-occupied condos, and this is where I lived for 6 years. It's really wonderful to be able to do that. The university would have torn it down, but for UCCA stopping them from tearing it down. Then we get the Sassy Cat block, the Garden Theater block. So this was the worst block between downtown and New Center. And you have what was the Sassy Cat, exactly what you think. And it's had some fires in it, and you have these kind of really yucky infill buildings from the 60s, And it's a mess. And no one can develop it because there's no parking. And the parking requirements are such that if you go to try and do anything here, you have to provide, and there's no way to provide the parking. So a group of investors got together, they bought the block, and they bought some land across the street in another apartment building, and they were going to put a big apartment on the next block, or a big parking deck on the next block, and then put a bridge over and keep the theater, but build this big thing over the theater. And it was like, this is never going to happen. Fortunately, they came to us, and we came up with a different strategy. So what we did was nestled a new parking behind the existing buildings here and here, and then put in a new building here where those two-story buildings, one and two-story buildings were, and then on the end, somebody else put a large housing development. This is one building, operates as one building. It's got one circulation system that runs through the back and all ties into the parking lot, but it provides an urban character that you couldn't possibly provide with a single building, unless it looks like, you know, the Myers we see around with the fake little, you know, storefronts. So if you get creative, there's amazing the things that you can do. And this is certainly an example of that. And you say, oh, well, the theater doesn't have its cornice back. But I take a long-term perspective. That cornice will get back. It's just a matter of time. Because as things get better, then it will pay for it and it will happen. And I may not see it, but I guarantee you my kids will see it. And so again, we take this long perspective of how do you deal with these buildings, and you don't have to make it perfect now, you have to make it better, and you have to create a future that these buildings can continue to exist. Then we get the plaza. So this building, when I was in school, as I mentioned, my professors were into urban renewal. So the main professor I had was a guy named Jerry Crane, and he master planned the medical center in Detroit. And the medical center, this is Woodward, the medical center is here, it's back here. And the goal was to have the medical center here, to tear down everything between John R. and Woodward and put in towers in the park. And this was the first tower in the park, and it had a little two-story addition here and parking in front. And there were supposed to be 4 other towers when I eventually saw the plan. And I always use this as the example how not to build a city. You know, the building didn't relate to the street, it had parking in front of it, you know, it's not the greatest building. And then time goes on, and a client comes to me and goes, we want to redo this building. So ironically, we got it listed on the National Register as an example of what they were doing in the 50s. We actually put the plaza that was originally planned in front of it back in front of it, so that it actually has a plaza for the street. They're putting in first floor, there's a bar and a little restaurant in it, so it again creates some activity on the first floor, and then luxury apartments on the upper floors. Also full all the time. It's actually pretty nice. But it just shows you never know in life what's going to come. So at this point, Midtown is obviously being very successful. And we get to 2000, and it's like, oh, Midtown's so wonderful. You know, it's the overnight success that was literally 20 years in the making of save this building, save this building, save this building. And so the powers that be said, well, we need to expand UCCA into a much bigger area. So they start to look at really everything from downtown, from where 75 comes north of downtown, up to New Center, to create a new neighborhood. Because Midtown didn't exist before 2000. And so they create Midtown Detroit, and they're able to really rebrand Cass Corridor and Brush Park, and these things that have these really negative images in the public as Midtown. And we know these places are really changing from what they were in the 60s and 70s, but a lot of the public, like you guys, doesn't know. And Midtown kind of helps that happen in terms of a public identity. So we're going to talk about some of the areas outside of that core UCC area. And the first is Techtown, which is right north of the freeway, right north of Wayne State. And so Wayne State and the state buy this building, which still belongs to GM. It was a building that was built to do the repairs to the Chevrolets early on. And then over time, it's really just used for storage and pretty underutilized. And they turned it into Techtown, which is an incubator for high-tech businesses. And one of the first ones they do is a company called Asteran, which figures out how to grow skin to help people that have had burns. It's a successful company. Loads of little entrepreneurs go through here. It's a great incubator space. They do training and give lots of support to entrepreneurs. Somebody's got a dinger going. So that works. So then what happens, at the same time, the state and the university opened Next Energy across the street, which is looking at how do we modernize our energy system in the state as a whole. And then we start to get these loft apartment buildings. So this is a graphic arts building that was vacant for a long time, and it gets redone as lofts, and is still rental lofts. And we get the New Amsterdam building, which was actually occupied by a company that was a printing company of some sort. They moved out of the city, and the buildings became available, and these were also turned into a single loft development, which continues to operate successfully. And then we get the Dalglish building. So this was a Cadillac dealership for like since the 30s. This building had been a Cadillac dealership. And one of the really cool things about this building was they had ramps for the cars to get up and down, because it was, the upper floors were all car maintenance. The first floor was a showroom, and the upper floors were car maintenance. And there was this there was these holes in the floor that had this kind of vertical belt, and you stepped on the belt, and it took you from floor to floor. I'd never seen anything like this. This was still operating in about 2010 when we started this project. Phenomenal. But the university bought the building, and they needed a high-tech medical research building. So they converted the Dalglish part of the building and then put this major addition on it, and it's now a lab building to help them attract the kind of talent they needed on their staff to stay a major research facility. It's very cool. Then across the street from the Amsterdam lofts, the Pistons moved back to town, and they put in their training facility. Again, this stuff doesn't happen if the old buildings don't get done first, because when the old buildings are sitting there as I'm scared of that building, you don't tend to have things happening across the street. Once they're done, then the things start to happen around them. So you see the Pistons come in. This was actually Cadillac headquarters. It had, on the second floor was the showroom, and the first floor was retail, and then the upper floors were car maintenance and research and stuff. And that building sat vacant for a long time, and it is now kind of, it's office. It's also that kind of, you can rent a small space type of office. It was going to be WeWork, but I think they're doing something similar to WeWork on their own in it. And then we get the schools. So the Thompson Foundation committed to doing schools in Detroit with a commitment to 90% graduation, 90% college acceptance. So they've got 2 elementary schools and a high school in the neighborhood. So now let's talk about New Center. So of course, in the 20s, as the car industries are taking off, is Ford's in Dearborn, and Chrysler's in Highland Park, and GM does not want to be downtown. So they create their own downtown 2 miles north of the real downtown, which is New Center, and then we get New Center. So Detroit has these kind of 2 downtowns that are a mile apart or 2 miles apart. And so the Argonaut building was the building where they did all their research. It was the design building. They had this big Lazy Susan type thing where the cars would go around for when they were showing them off and photographing them. But they had moved out to the tech center in Warren, and this building was kind of just used as back of office space and was really underutilized. So they sold it to Center for Creative Studies, who now has their graduate program there. And so they got people designing cars again in the building. I always thought this was really cool. They also have a dorm in the building. There's a charter high school in the building around design and the arts. And so the building is really highly activated again. And then the Albert Kahn building, which was offices, largely, one of the big tenants was the office firm of Albert Kahn. They moved into the Fisher building, and then this was sold, and it is now apartments. Very nice apartments. And then you start to get the new construction. So this is 2 blocks away from the Fisher building. Obviously apartments on the upper floor, a parking garage hidden in the middle of it, and first floor retail. Then we get to Brush Park on the southern part of the district. And this to me is one of the most interesting stories. So this is a mansion that was built by a guy named James Scott. And he was a self-made man in the 1880s. And he was rather brash, you know, liked to swear, liked women, liked to drink, liked cigars, all those kinds of things. So the hoity-toity of Detroit totally rejected him. So when he built his mansion, he put the back of the mansion to the city, and it's really plain red brick, and faced it away from the city, because he was showing them off. He also, for those who are going on the tour, when he died, donated the money to build the Scott Fountain on Belle Isle, but only if they would put a statue to him on the site. So there's a statue to John Scott with that gorgeous fountain on Belle Isle. But already when I was in school in the 70s, because we were doing projects in this area, this building was vacant. So it continued to deteriorate for another 30 years. And it was bought by a guy named Joel Landy, who had bought a lot of land around there and had done some things with the land. And then he finally figured out, you know, he was going to do this project. And he put together the financing to do it, and he got really sick. He had this bone deterioration disease where he couldn't walk around. His bones were literally crumbling. And so he was desperately looking for somebody to take this project over. But it takes that kind of really hands-on guy to be able to do this, and I couldn't do it. You know, other people were going, we just can't make the numbers work, because it really takes this kind of hands-on approach that he had. I mean, he would directly hire, you know, Eastern Europeans with the trades and have them do the work, so he wasn't using contractors. He could really control his costs. Thank God they found a drug. And he, all of a sudden, literally came back from the dead, finished this project. His houses, not multifamily houses, really, really nice job. I mean, the guy's phenomenal. And then, unfortunately, he was carrying an oxygen tank, and he wouldn't quit smoking. So he died, which is so unfortunate. But this was his last gift to the city. And it really shows the importance to me of these people who will take risks that big companies won't take. These little guys, and totally unimpressive looking. You'd think he was a street person to see him, smoking, really skinny, you know, and you talk to him, really, really bright. And yet, if you support these people, the things they can do is pretty amazing. Then we get the other one. To me, there are two symbols in the public eye of the deterioration of Detroit. And one of them is this house, the Ransom Gillis house in Brush Park. Now, Brush Park looked the way that it did because the city owned these Victorian houses, bought them during the age of a prior governor or prior mayor who really thought they should be all torn down because this should be a denser part of the city. And partially he was right, and you'll see why in a minute, but partially he was wrong because there's room for both density and having these kind of buildings. But the city didn't have the money to tear them down, and they couldn't use federal money to tear them down because they were a National Historic Landmark. So there they sit, and they just deteriorate and deteriorate and deteriorate, and everybody loves photographing them. But then Bedrock buys them and redoes them, and this one gets done. You've heard the story of this as a TV show, and it's really nicely done. And they redo the rest of the Victorian houses on the street, and then they build the new infill. Now, somehow they get this through the historic district, which I think these are probably no longer a historic district. Is it a great urban neighborhood? Absolutely. There's a feeling of life in this neighborhood now that you wouldn't have imagined. And probably wouldn't have been if it was just all Victorian houses either. It's kind of the mix is really nice. We have these Victorian houses, and then you have this variety of infill, some of it affordable, some of it not affordable. But it's a pretty cool neighborhood. People will come eventually from around the world to see this and see what was happening here, because from an architectural standpoint, it's really quite interesting. So that's Brush Park. Then, all of a sudden, new buildings start popping up all over the neighborhood. You know, you've got actually UCCA developed this one as their offices. We had our offices in here. This is in the western part of the neighborhood. This is on Woodward. This is on Woodward. The quality of design keeps getting better because you can get more stuff financed. I think there's a better understanding of the importance of design in terms of the people who are providing the subsidies to build these things. So the neighborhood is now really on its own. It doesn't need UCCA or Midtown or an organization to keep it going. It's going to continue to improve over time. COVID's problem, I don't know what the long-term impact is COVID. So far, the housing is all still full. There's a lot of housing in the pipeline. Does it all still fill up? There are a lot of people who want to live down here. When we did that Garfield building originally in the 90s, we did a map to show what was going on around it. And all of a sudden, you've got all these cultural institutions, and you've got these sports facilities, and you've got these parks, and I'm just going, I could live here. And it has only gotten better in terms of the quality of life that you can live down there. So I suspect that you're going to see more empty nesters moving down there, and you'll continue to see young people. When they have kids, they're going to move out of the city. But only less than 20% of households have children, so there's no reason to see that this can't continue at some level. So now let's talk about downtown. So what I think is really wonderful about downtown is this screwy street pattern. Judge Woodward, when the town burned in the early 1800s, and Woodward said, oh wait, don't rebuild it, let's plan it. And he talked with, or studied what LaPlante had done in Washington, D.C., and came up with this idea of this radial city that's based around these round parks. Only half of this one got built as Grand Surface Park. But the idea of these radial streets where you've got Woodward going out, and Michigan Avenue, and Grand River, and Gratiot, and Jefferson, but they don't all come together. I don't know what he was drinking when he put this together, but I suspect some of it is because how it was, and never an idea that these would become such grand streets as they did become. But what this does is this weird street pattern gives us all these parks. So you've got a city that has all these gathering spaces. It's only about a mile square, so it's very walkable downtown. It's really a wonderful downtown. And it's got all these green spaces. I mean, think downtown Manhattan. I mean, it's got Grand Central Park, but we've got Belle Isle. But you've got these grids, or Chicago, you've got these grids that are unbroken, and the views are unbroken. And in Detroit, we've got this, without the messy street patterns of Boston, which also has really cool streets. So what happens in downtown Detroit is that you also have this massive disinvestment and all these vacant buildings and buildings being torn down. And they put together the partnership to kind of deal with the public structure part of it that we saw in the Main Street program, where they take care of the streets, they keep them clean, they take care of the parks, they plant and they do events, lots of events, especially now that they've done Campus Martius. And then you have DEGC, who's helping the private sector develop, helping them put together the financing and get controlled buildings to make things happen. And it starts really in the late 80s with the old Wayne County building. So the county offices are in here. The building really needs major investment. So the county decides to move it out and actually keep the building and lease the building to a private developer so that they can develop it. So they do that. And then they lease it back to the county as their offices. But what was interesting is, I remember the day we went into here, got this tall ladder and looked up, and this is what was up there. I mean, what they did in the 50s to these buildings is just mind-boggling to me. So we, of course, took it back, and it's a gorgeous building. Since then, the county moved out, and it's sitting vacant. It's owned by some New York investors. They are at least taking good care of it. They've redone the roofs, and I keep it heated in the winter, and they're just looking for the right development. So I'm really curious to see what they do with this. I personally see they own a little lot behind it. I see a hotel behind it, and this is the convention center or something. It'll be interesting to see what happens, but they can wait, so that'll take a while. Then you get the Fox Theater. So Little Caesars, the Illich family comes in and buys it and redoes it, and it's now a venue that things are going on all the time in, and it is incredibly beautiful. One of the cool things about it, it has one of the longest span balconies on a theater in the country. And what they discovered is when there were rock concerts there is that the balcony would start to sway. So they literally put in a counter sway system to stop it from swaying. It's really kind of high tech, it's really cool. So this is wonderful. And then of course their offices are in the tower above it. And then you get the Detroit Opera House. It was raining inside in here in the 80s. And now it's back in the Opera House and having events all year round in it. Then we get the first Lost downtown. This row of buildings is the Woodward Lofts. It was the first ones that were done downtown by the Farbman Company. Again, very successful. And then across the street, we get the Merchants Row Lofts, which are these, and then in the next block, these. And what they did was really cool is that they, it's not in this picture, but they actually hit a vertical parking deck that they get at with a valet parking with an elevator. They looked at a mechanical one and they didn't trust it, so they didn't do the mechanical one, or it didn't make sense. So again, they've hidden the parking and the thing works and it's pretty successful. And then it gets kind of stable, not much happens, not much happens. And Fort Shelby around the corner does happen. So this is hotel and luxury apartments, which are now being condoed. Again, you can see this building was raining inside. It was vacant for about 17 years. And after I walked out of it, I threw my shoes away because I thought how much of asbestos of lead. And I had little kids at home. It's like, I'm not even walking in the house with these shoes. I just threw them away. It was awful. But you know, these buildings come back. I mean, my fear was I would retire and I would have nightmares because of all these awful buildings I had been in. I remember all the great details and put them together into fantastic buildings. So there's hope in life. The Book Cadillac also had been redone in the 70s and then failed again and went vacant and was then redone and is now as a hotel with luxury condos on the upper floors. Then we get the Super Bowl. Now, the good thing about the Super Bowl is that there was a commitment to clean up Woodward. So Woodward was, of course, the retail base of downtown. It had Hudson's on it, and Kern department store, and all Winkleman's and all these kind of great stores. But it had gone vacant, and there was like a lot of vacancies. Everybody had gates, the big metal gates. And it looked really scary. And they had done the public improvements. It still looked scary because of what was going on. Well, the Super Bowl, they said, this can't be. So the Detroit Partnership got some grant money, went to the owners and said, we'll pay half the cost if you clean up your storefronts. We cleaned up 25 storefronts. So by the time the public came, it was downtown looked great. They had displays in the empty ones. They got temporary occupancies in some of the buildings so that it looked like a live downtown and didn't look scary, which is part of the importance of what it looks like matters. Because it probably wasn't really a scary, dangerous place. It actually wasn't. It felt like it was. When we were done with getting ready for the Super Bowl, it didn't feel that way. So that's one thing I actually give Kwame credit for. He made this, he got the Super Bowl to come and he got the downtown cleaned up. Then things start to happen. So then you have the towers of neglect. So this is about 2000, and the newspapers are screaming about, what's happening with all these buildings, and they all need to be torn down. They've all been vacant forever. We need to get rid of them. So let's see what happened. So first we had the Book Cadillac, which we just looked at. That becomes a hotel and luxury apartments. The next one we have is the Broderick Tower. And I saw a plan when we were doing those storefronts to tear down this one and the Whitney because they were the entrance to downtown, and we can't have these big vacant buildings at the entrance to downtown. Fortunately, they couldn't come up with the money to tear them down, so that really helped. So the Broderick is now apartments with retail and some office on the lower floors. The next one is David Whitney, which is a hotel on the bottom half of the building and apartments on the upper half of the building. With a fantastic, another one. Detroit has just wonderful architecture. We are so lucky. It was, what they built from about 1915 to 1930 was just phenomenal. The Farwell building is now first floor retail, upper floor lofts. Really, really cool. Central stairway. The Lafayette building, tore it down. There's now a little park on the site. I think this was a mistake. I think they were better off with the building than this little park, but it's gone. The real mistake is the Madison Lennox. I did walk through this building. This was a really reusable building of the right scale in the right place. It should be housing. But it sat in the view of Tiger Stadium, and the Illiches said, we will not look at a vacant building. So they convinced the city to let them tear it down because it was dangerous. And I can remember talking to the head of the building department at the time, and he said they promised they'll build a new building there. I said, I don't believe it. And they didn't. It's now 20 years later, and it's still a parking lot. And so instead, you're looking at the back of a building. They should have just put the bloody money in and rehabbed it. But spilt milk, gone. Metropolitan building, really cool building. Triangular footprint, so a real challenge. What do you do with this? And it is now a extended stay hotel with also really cool lobby space. Those who go on the tour will see this one. Michigan Central Station, as we know, Ford is now looking at that, and unfortunately, I don't have updated photographs on this one. This is when I knew I had to retire, when I didn't want to stay. I had done the original condition assessment on this building, didn't want to stay to rehab it. But it's will open by the end of the year. The United Arts building is now underway to be housing. They actually tore down the theater, which is unfortunate, but at least the office tower will be housing. And the Wurlitzer buildings. This was another one of those ones where I looked at for so many people because it was so narrow, you just couldn't get it to work as housing, which is the easiest thing to do with these buildings is housing. But this group came out of New York and turned it into a hotel with really little tiny rooms. And they're targeting young people where it's affordable, it's still expensive, affordable with the idea that the downtown is their play space. They're really just sleeping here. And it's pretty successful. They've done some really cool things with the interior of the building too. The Statler, this is another one that I walked through, and I can remember walking through and seeing all these structural clay tiles on the floor going, do I dare walk on the floor above? But I was actually wrong, because they weren't structural. They were just spacers that were used for the concrete tees that were the actual structure, and it was structurally sound. So instead, we have the City Center building, and you decide which one is better. It's again, sometimes you just have to wait. You have to give it time to happen. Because these things that I'm showing you, this is 30 years of progress in the city. But sometimes you just have to wait. Don't do the wrong thing. So out of those buildings, we lost 3 of them. And actually, all the rest of them are now improved. No one would have dreamed this would have happened 20 years ago. And it certainly has happened. Other towers that have since been done, the Book Tower just got finished. Incredible. This was another atrium that was totally covered up. You couldn't see it and boarded over. And they've done a beautiful job restoring it. David Stott Building is now housing. Free Press Building is now housing with first floor retail. Detroit News Building is office. Federal Reserve Building is office. So beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That's it for today.
Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah, great. Liz, thank you so much. This was a fascinating talk. We're all calling our realtors and putting our houses on the market. Down to Detroit we go. So thank you very much. I just wanted to remind everybody in the audience that you can write questions on the cards and give them to the 2 mic handlers on the 2 sides. So we'll go ahead. So let me get started. Started with first question. It has to do with financing. Mm-hmm. And so the question really has to do with the issue of kind of the domino effect that you were talking about before. So how do you kind of get the renewal started to get, when private funding won't come in, what is the process to get probably the public funding first and then get the follow-on and private investment when it makes sense for private?
So most of these projects are financed with, we call it a stack of financing, is that you do the project, you figure out what you can get for a mortgage, which might be half of what you need, and then you start to look at what other sources are. There are federal historic preservation tax credits, which will cover about 20% of project costs, which is more like 30% of construction costs. And then there are different grants and state programs, and you just start to go from one to the next to the next to the next, and you layer on this financing. One of the things you'll see is that the projects tend to start smaller and then get bigger, because even in the public sector financing, you have to kind of convince them that it's going to work. So you start with the smaller projects and work with the bigger ones. But all of these projects have financial consultants that help them put together all these sources. But there are a lot of sources out there, and it can be done.
Great. Thank you. We'll switch now to the audience questions. The first one here is, can you discuss the technical challenges of converting office towers to residential?
So office towers actually work well to convert them to residential, and obviously we're going to, I think, see a lot more of that happen. The first thing is that you got to put in all new building systems because you need to be able to control the heating and the cooling per unit. And when an office tower, it tends to be per floor or per half of a floor. So you tend to have to put in a new mechanical systems. And then, of course, all new plumbing systems, because there's nowhere near enough water in these buildings. They've got to be sprinkled because of the change of use to residential requires that they have a fire suppression system. They have to have a fire alarm system. So basically, you have a shell, but everything that goes in the shell is going to be new. And you might keep corridor walls and some pieces of the old building, but basically, you really only have the shell of the building. The challenge with office buildings that are currently occupied is that they're worth too much as an office building, even half occupied, because you really have to get the value down that the value of the building is the value of the shell, which is kind of probably about half the cost of the building. And then the other half, all those building systems have to be redone. Once the building gets to the point where you got to redo them anyway, because the systems are 50 years old, then it starts to make more economic sense and you can start to make it work. But it's really doable. I'm hearing a lot of, oh, it's so difficult, it's so difficult. It's a matter of putting together the financing. And by the way, suburban development is all subsidized in its own way. We all pay for the roads, we all pay for the schools, we all pay to expand the water systems to support this development. So putting that money instead into urban centers makes some sense in terms of a more efficient use of land. So we've done we've done 2 glass office towers into housing. So we've done these 1950s buildings and a lot of 1920s buildings into housing. It's doable. It's a challenge. It's not as easy as building a new building on a green field, but it's very doable.
Great. Thank you. So we'll do another one from the audience. Thank you.
Question is, did housing subsidies such as those offered by Wayne State U to rent or buy in Midtown play a significant role?
They played a role. I wouldn't say a significant role. What they really have helped is keep that neighborhood diverse. That neighborhood is racially diverse, economically diverse, and educationally diverse. It's diverse in every way. It really got people to move downtown, but it also helped people stay in the neighborhood that were getting priced out of the neighborhood. So you have this balance that occurs. So it helped, but it wasn't the primary engine.
Great. So this next question is from the online audience, and this has to do with the schools and asking about the schools. And you mentioned one of these developments had several schools associated with it. Do you see that becoming an emerging issue that the schools will improve?
Well, the schools are a huge challenge for the city in my mind. You have the charter schools. They siphon off a few of the stronger families. You have like the Thompson schools, which do that. The public schools, VD's doing what he can. I mean, one of his problems was the facilities, and he now, because of the COVID money, has money to deal with the facilities. But when you put all of the poor kids together, you got to figure out how to educate them, which to me is a problem beyond the schools. And until we as a society to deal with that, I don't see how you make the Detroit schools attractive to middle-class families. So the schools, to me, are going to continue to be a challenge, an ongoing challenge in the city.
Okay, great.
This is a very broad question, is what has development done to the locals, gentrification versus affordability?
So Detroit lost 2/3 of its population. So there's lots of room in Detroit to bring in people with money without displacing people. I've done literally hundreds and hundreds of housing things. Almost every project has some affordable housing in it. It's a requirement that the city has. And so there's an affordable component in it. The Midtown neighborhood has a community development organization that has, I should have showed you some of their buildings, in fact, as I didn't, because they've done a beautiful job with some of these historic buildings, providing really low-income housing for kind of the lowest tier. So that I think you can absorb a lot of, quote, gentrification in Detroit without moving anybody.
So our next question has to do with the queue line, and if you could describe, what effect that has had on development, and maybe you can broaden the question a little bit in terms of just the transportation issue.
Well, the queue line, everybody was really excited about the queue line. And then it opened and it didn't run often enough. And it got stopped by traffic. So all of us that were really planning on using it went right away back to Uber. Because Uber, you could get there in 10 minutes and you didn't have to wait. So it works. I think it's still a little bit of a toy. I don't think it's had much impact on the development. I do think that there are people who live in Midtown and work downtown and vice versa that use the queue line, but it doesn't run often enough. It's got to run more to really be effective.
Great.
Can you discuss the development of public transportation?
Yeah, I actually don't know a lot about public transportation. The city system, one of the real problems is you've got the smart suburban system and the DOT city system, and they don't talk to each other at all. If you take the suburban system, you come from the suburbs and it stops downtown. And it doesn't stop in between, it won't pick anybody up, and it won't drop you off in between. And then you've got the DOT system, which is getting better. It's definitely gotten better under Duggan, but it has a ways to go. It's a real challenge when you have a city that's as spread out as Detroit and as low density as Detroit to get it to work. You really, the old streetcars, they worked because they ran often, and public transit is a challenge, and I don't know what the answer is. Certainly as we get more density downtown, that works. You can start to get it to work within that area. I do think that the queue line eventually will work to get people around between downtown and Midtown.
So the next question is the role of Dan Gilbert, both in terms of how he might have facilitated the development and what's happening now after his stroke.
So Dan Gilbert came in because there was a fire sale on big buildings, when the city really bottomed out about 2012. And he has really done a beautiful job on many of the buildings that he's done. Personally, I think it's dangerous when one person owns that much of a downtown. What happens when his business starts to fail, or what? Because he's filling a lot of those buildings with his own things. So that scares me some, but they've done a beautiful job. And the buildings they've done a beautiful job. There's no doubt that there were things happening slowly, and he just put a torch to it, just took off after he came in. So he really does need to get credit. And it's still happening even after his stroke. They're still finishing the buildings. They've got like the book tower they just finished. And I don't know if he'll be buying more. I just don't know. I don't have an inside line on it. But Detroit does have him to thank for a lot.
Great.
I have two questions here from a member who has some personal reminiscence of the earlier part of her life. In my 20s, I would drive to Detroit to socialize. I think there was one of the restaurants was named the Rhinoceros, if correct. Is it still there?
No.
I know I would like to go, and at that time we docked on the river. Can't remember the name. Do you know?
Well, I'm going to totally blank out. The restaurants in Detroit now will compete with anybody in the world. Because when the default occurred and they went into bankruptcy, it got so cheap to come into Detroit, and everybody knew it. All of a sudden, all these young people came into town and said, oh, I can start a restaurant here for a quarter of what I can start it for in Manhattan. I'm going to open a restaurant. And so there are these fantastic restaurants. And you'll hear, some of them make it, some of them don't, but there's always a new one coming up. And COVID really hurt. They're back. I mean, check out the restaurants in Detroit, the Foundation, Vertical, and there's some other new ones, the names I can't think of right now, but fantastic food. We got so spoiled when we lived down there. It was not good, actually.
Was that a two-part question?
I had
Rooster Tail is on the river. Rooster Tail.
As a teen, I had a boyfriend by the name of Ray, okay, who attended Wilbur Wright Trade School. Is the trade school still exist? Do you know?
I don't know. Wright still exists as a school. I don't know if it's a trade school.
Great. So our next question is, could you comment on what to do with the Packard Motors factory?
Oh, yeah. So I actually have this idea for the Packard Motor Factory. And if you, it is these two, or it's a bunch of buildings, but basically it's these two long buildings that are 4, 5, 6 stories tall on a street, on a central street. And I think that they should put big boxes in them on the first floor because there's enough head height. So, it's Target and it's Home Depot and it's all those things with the parking above it because the buildings can take the parking because the city has no retail. All the retail moved out and it rings the city, but it's not in the city. And so it really needs this big box retail, and I think that's what they should do with the Packard plant. I don't think it'll happen, but I think that's what they should do.
Okay, great. So the next question is, can you tell us about the cost per square foot to renovate or rehab an old structure as compared to new construction?
So the cost is actually similar because you have a frame that you're not paying for. So you put that money inside the building instead of into the frame. So it's more expensive, depends on the building. It really depends on the building. If you're building at the same density and the same locations, the costs are actually similar.
Okay, great. So Al, did you have another one? No. So the next question has to do with the tax base. So Mayor Duggan has recently proposed that changing this taxing to reduce it on homeowners and active structures and increasing it on land, on vacant land, assuming that that will be an incentive for folks to develop the land. What are your thoughts about that?
I think it's a brilliant idea. Because people, they bought these buildings and this land, in the 60s and 70s, and they're sitting on it, and because of the Headley Amendment, their taxes are frozen. So their holding costs are zero. I used to have a thing that we ought to tax the trees growing out of buildings because obviously it's valuable forest land if there's trees growing out of the roofs. And actually the Metropolitan Building had the last tree and we took it down about 5 years ago. But yet, no, I think that something to make it that people can't just sit on it would be helpful.
Okay. Have you seen examples of that working in other cities?
I think Pittsburgh did that.
Okay, great. So this is a great segue to the next question, which is how about planting trees? What is being done to plant trees?
Well, I do know they're planting a lot of trees, but I don't know much about it. Okay.
Great. So the next question has to do with the role of entrepreneurs. And so you've made the comment that local entrepreneurs will sometimes take a chance on something where you've got a national organization, that won't. Can you comment any further about the role of entrepreneurs in renovating cities?
Well, I think that the rebirth of areas like that starts with the entrepreneurs. Without the entrepreneurs, the local people, it doesn't happen because the savior doesn't come in from outside of town and take a risk on your town. It's the local people who take the risk on the town. So to me, they're absolutely critical in the beginning. And in the beginning, they're characters. I've had a lot of them as clients. They're characters. They're not the guy in the tie, and not that anybody wears a tie anymore, but they're characters, and you have to look at their vision and look at, can they pull it off, and they are absolutely key. And then I think they stay key because if you look at, the different examples that I gave you in Midtown, is that the interesting stuff are done by entrepreneurs. Mm-hmm. They'll do things because they want to do it, and they can afford to do it, and I think they're absolutely key.
Okay. And this is a second question that is related to entrepreneurship, and you were talking about TechTown as an incubator for high tech, and you used the example of growing skin and using university technologies. Can you talk any further about kind of what the long-term development effects have been of these high-tech entrepreneurs?
I actually don't know. Okay. I do know that also there's stuff going around the tech industry downtown, and that you're getting some spin-offs. Is it the next Silicon Valley? I don't know. Mm-hmm. I know that they're trying, but there is stuff going on, and there are companies starting, but I actually just don't know.
Okay, great. So our next question is, what advice do you have for young people aspiring to become architects?
Number one, you have to really want it. And then the second thing is find what you want to do in it, and just start small, and then eventually you'll find the path. You just take the next step, and then you'll find the path, and the next one will be there. At least that's what I did, and it worked.
Okay, so there are job opportunities.
Oh,
in-
right now, there's nowhere near enough architects, and the prediction with all the retiring of our generation is that there's going to be a demand for architects for a while. So yeah, there's a lot of need for architects, even in Michigan, which has not always been the best state for architects. Loads of demand.
Okay, great. One little quick question is, the tour that you're going to be doing on June 23rd, does it include the Guardian Building?
No, it doesn't. And the Guardian Building is wonderful.
Okay.
But we can't walk that far. It's too much out of the way.
Oh, okay. I think you're going to have so much demand that we're going to ask you to do more than one tour.
Well,
I'm just,
we'll see how the first one
yeah,
goes.
I'm just predicting.
Yeah.
So the next question has to do with, you've mentioned some coalitions that have been formed to be able to do some bold things like rehab buildings rather than take them down. Can you tell us a little bit more about how these coalitions form and who instigates them, and maybe ways that they can be encouraged?
It's usually some individual or a couple of people or 3 or 4 people who just fall in love with the building. Mm-hmm. And then they, we can't let it go down, we can't let it go down. And if they start early enough and take the idea that I'm going to solve the problem, I'm not going to tell you, building owner, to solve the problem, they'll often find the way to do it. Because there's often public support for saving these buildings, so it's a matter of finding a path, and somebody has to take it on. So it's somebody, the Save Orchestra Hall folks, they were crazy, quite frankly, to think that they could do that. But they saw that building as being so important from its history and its acoustics that they found a way. And it's I'm going to find a way, and I'm going to do it. We are going to do it. It's not going to say, I don't believe in laying down the floor in front of the bulldozers. It's too late then. You have to get to it before that, and while the building still has a chance.
Okay.
But it really is, it's about individuals.
Okay. So the next question has to do with climate net zero for the buildings. A two-part question. One is, what role are you seeing that playing in the development, that plans, for architects, but also is there financing that's available in order to promote, energy-efficient buildings?
So it's really a complex question. So again, it's how do you use the money that you're putting in the building anyway to make it more efficient? So the first thing is using your money right and planning it right. And that's a matter of working with your architects and making that a priority, that we're going to make the building energy efficient. Are there subsidies for just doing that? No. But you've got a subsidy for doing a historic building that pays for 20% of your mechanical system. So you've already got a 20% subsidy going in. So it's how you use the resources and how you do it. It's really looking at the building holistically and how you use it. And when you're reusing an existing building, all of the energy that went into building that building frame that you're reusing, you don't have to recreate to create a new building. And Carl will talk about this, that the greenest building is a building that's already built because of all of the energy that's embodied in the building. So you can look at it from one standpoint. There's the replace the windows thing. Oh, you got to replace the windows, you got to replace the windows. If you do a study on replacing the windows, there's a 40-year payback in terms of energy efficiency. It doesn't make sense. You're much better off putting solar panels on your roof. That has a 15-year payback. And yet the industry is selling it's all about the windows. It's not all about the windows. And so it's really about stepping back and looking at each building and what makes sense for that building.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. The next one is, what impact will completion of the new bridge to Canada have on Detroit real estate valuations and building activity?
My prediction is none. I think it will probably help the neighborhood around the base of the Ambassador Bridge, because it'll get the trucks off the road. And they really negatively impact that neighborhood pretty significantly. So I think getting the trucks off of that will help that area. For the rest, I don't think it's going to have that big of an impact on the city itself. Hopefully it has an impact on Fort Wayne, because Fort Wayne is right there. That should be a major tourist attraction. And at some point, somebody's going to have to put in the tens of millions it's going to take to make it work, but it should be a greenfield village. It should have as many people coming to it as that, or certainly, in that category. And so that's the one thing I really see happening is Fort Wayne.
Okay, great. So the next question has to do with population. So you've described all these very attractive housing options for folks now, but the population in the city of Detroit really doesn't seem to have budged very much. Can you comment about that?
Well, there is this mysterious loss of 25 to 35-year-olds. It's young families. They're still leaving the cities. It's about the schools, and I don't know what the fix of the schools is. There is an influx of young people coming in, or not even just young people, of people coming in and living in the center city. It's not offsetting what's still going out of the neighborhoods. And so ultimately, they've got to figure out what to do with the schools to stop the population loss. Okay. And by the way, the whole region is losing people. It's not just Detroit.
Right. Yeah, we're like the bottom of the barrel.
Yeah, it's not just Detroit.
Okay. So the next question has to do with the tax base. So again, back to taxes. Can't get away from taxes. But the idea that the tax revenues have been increasing over time with all of this development. And maybe you can comment on kind of what you see as the fiscal health of the city now compared to 20 years ago.
Well, I mean, I think the bankruptcy, they kind of got their house back in order, but there's a real problem with how Michigan finances its cities. By over-relying on property taxes, if you get cities, Ypsilanti is always my example. You've got this small, bound city with no vacant land in it, so it's not getting new development, which is where the tax base tends to grow in cities. And so it can't grow, so it only grows when people sell their houses, which doesn't happen all that often, especially in these older cities that are really stable. So they get this tax base that doesn't keep up with inflation because it can only go up 3%. It can't keep up with inflation. So there's this trap built into our tax system that's killing these older cities that don't have a lot of new development. On the other side of that, Detroit has all this new development, and it's so valuable that you go to buy a condo in the Book Cadillac building, and your yearly taxes are $28,000. I mean, it just doesn't work. And they've done all this development on things that freeze the tax base, and now those freezes are coming off, and I'm going to be really interesting to see what happens because there's going to be reductions in the value of these units because the property taxes are so high. So you've got all this property that's older houses that has really low taxes, and then you have this new development and they're way up here. There needs to be a way to compromise it out that it's more reasonable for everybody. It's a tough problem. It's a tough problem. And they pay income tax. So
to the city?
To the city, yeah.
Okay, all right, good. We have time for one more question, if there's anybody in the audience who's got a burning issue.
Is there any movement towards the west side of Detroit? The corridor, Woodward corridor seems to be taking it all up. What's happening on either east or west?
Well, there's two things. So Corktown with the train station, actually moving Tiger Stadium out of Corktown was a blessing for Corktown over the long run. There's all sorts of new housing being built in Corktown. That's only going to be more as the train station opens back up. So it's going west into Corktown and going into North Corktown and up into Woodbridge. So that area is going. The Ford Hospital, which is to the west of New Center, is also committed to its neighborhood. You've got the new Motown Museum going in there. So it's broadening out another mile to the west. And the neighborhoods, the historic neighborhoods, are actually doing pretty well in terms of house values and properties turning in and new people coming in. To the east, you've got Lafayette Park, which stays strong. If they take out 375, you're just going to see that getting better. And then the riverfront also going down, connecting. They're just finishing the walkway along the riverfront, the Riverwalk, and you're going to see all that start to develop too. So it's also going east. And there's pockets of stuff happening all over. I think you're going to see Detroit rebuilt almost as a series of villages where you have there's a lot going on here, and there's a lot going on here, and then there's less going on in between. It won't fill up back the way it was. And it shouldn't fill up back the way it was. It doesn't make sense.
So just one other question was about urban farms. So there's been a discussion of trying to have some of this land, become farmland. What are your thoughts about that?
I think it's great, and there are some really idealistic people doing it, and it's working. I'd be really leery about actually farming in the soil without testing it, but they say they do that, or they bring in new soil. And you've got, somebody asked about trees. I mean, there's all these tree farms on the east side of Detroit, although that was a land giveaway, in my opinion. And so, yeah, I do think that, and you're going to see more walkways and greenways that they're starting to put in to kind of use up some of this land. So it will be, so I one, my last pronouncement of wisdom is that downtown Detroit in 15 to 20 years will be the best live-work downtown in the country, with a mix of uses and in terms of quality of life that you can have in that heart of the downtown and going up through Midtown. It's the quality of the architecture, the quality of the amenities, and the concentration of them in that area is bar none in terms of its potential.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. This has been such an uplifting and exciting discussion today. We are very grateful for your time. Thank you. And I'm predicting that you'll have another very interesting tour on the 23rd of June with us. And again, thank you for that.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you.